Hi, and welcome back to Let's Talk with the Meinhardt. I'm Ron Meinhardt, your host.
And I'm Hannah Meinhardt, your co-host.
And today we have some really exciting things to talk about, don't we?
Yes, we do. We're going to be talking about this current government shutdown and natural rights.
And those are two of my favorite topics, aren't they?
Yes.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
The new generation, indoctrination, separation to destroy our nation. Each family the call, it's time for true liberty and justice for all. Let's talk
with the Meinhardts.
So, Hannah, tell us a little bit more about this big government shutdown that's going on.
Yes, so this is actually, like he said, approaching the longest government shutdown in the U.S. history. It is between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans wanted to pass a temporary spending bill, but the Democrats want some increased subsidies for the Affordable Care Act.
Okay. And actually, they want to bring back some subsidies that were canceled. Now, let's take a step back because I like to make this educational. And I'm going to ask you a question. I know you know the answer. And I want to ask you the question as well, see if you know the answer. Why is it that Congress has to pass these bills that provide for funding? Can't the government just fund itself?
Well, Congress is you'd say the purse of the government.
Mm-hmm.
So if Congress can't even figure out how to appropriate the money, who's going to?
Yeah, who's going to, and who is enabled by the Constitution? It's just Congress.
Yes.
The president can't do it. So that puts the federal government in a sort of dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
If especially in a two-party system, if they can't really make up their minds, then that's when you get the government shutdowns. And as you mentioned, the competing factions right now are looking at, let's just potentially fund it temporarily, fund the government temporarily, let people get paid and that kind of thing. And the other side says, well, we really want those subsidies back.
Yes.
And those subsidies have to do with the topic we're going to delve into today, which is dealing with natural rights. And before we do that, let's just analyze the issue. What is the issue besides the fact that the ACA subsidies have been cut? What are those dealing with?
So those are dealing with, like he said, natural rights, because some people believe that those are natural rights. Everyone should be entitled to health care.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are the others that believe that those are not natural rights.
Okay, and specifically, we know that those ACA subsidies deal with funding for, let's say, emergency services, right?
Yes.
And I'm a registered nurse by trade. I've worked in public health. I've worked as an RN case manager. And in fact, I do have quite a bit of experience with this subject. So we had kind of a little crisis in our county. See, I worked outside the city of Chicago, and we had a large number of individuals that were undocumented, and they needed to get health care. And
Yes.
they didn't necessarily have it at that time. And so they thought, well, I'm sick. I'm going to go to the emergency room because by law, if you go to the emergency room, you have to receive treatment. And that's a good
Yes.
thing. But the hospitals need to pay for, those services. They need to pay their employees and they would like to get some of that money as well.
Yes.
Maybe build a new wing onto the hospital, eventually. So the patients do need to get charged somehow. But you can't really charge someone if they're undocumented, they don't have a
Yes.
way to pay or they're refusing to pay.
Yeah.
And so those subsidies were directly targeting those individuals that would go to the ER and use that as even primary care. And that was our crisis and when I was in public health. And I know that that's a contested crisis. I know I've read articles, I've read research papers that analyze this question, but we saw it firsthand. We knew that a lot of homeless and a lot of undocumented immigrants would utilize the ER as primary care. And we thought, well, we need to
Yes.
educate them that you don't necessarily need to do that. There are other services that are available. And as a case manager, that was part of my job to help people find services that they can utilize because the ER is it's highly specialized. It's there for emergencies.
Yes.
And so if you go there with just a headache, run-of-the-mill, primary care office that's not so highly specialized, it doesn't have a team of trauma surgeons, on call and
Yeah.
brain surgeons, all this stuff, they can take care of you for a lot less money,
Yes.
a lot less resources. So I think really, if we wanted to really argue the point, I think that we could say, hey, we don't necessarily need all those subsidies, even though it may help the crisis aspect of that. Instead, maybe we should educate people a little bit better,
Yes.
And hey, I love health education. You know that.
Yes.
And you grew up watching me give my health seminars,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So let's just talk just for a moment about some prevention. A study was done out in California. You could just take 5 glasses and 5 8-ounce glasses of water. We had almost a halving of heart disease risk.
Wow.
So imagine 50% reduction in heart disease risk just by drinking 5 of those 8-ounce glasses of water.
Wow.
That's hardly any water.
Yeah.
And we're 60% water by weight, So, and our lungs are like 80 to 90% water by weight. We need water. So it's not like we're doing ourselves a disservice by learning about prevention.
No.
We need it anyway. And imagine how many of those healthcare dollars could be saved. So I think the paradigm is all mixed up because we could make a big deal. We could shut down the whole government just because we want to fund the crisis, but we're not taking care of the underlying crisis.
Yes.
So there you have it. I do believe that education is really the key here.
Yes.
But that's kind of beside the point because we're going to talk about natural rights now. And natural rights are at the heat of this conflict. And the reason why is because of different worldviews. Okay, we're actually going to talk about worldviews as well. We should have mentioned that. So we'll bring that as a surprise now. What was the worldview that kind of founded the American Republic?
It was the biblical worldview.
Okay, and what is a biblical worldview? If you could just describe it very, very generally.
Using the Bible as your lens and how you see the world, basically.
Okay. All right, so from a biblical worldview, how would you describe crime?
Well, crime is disobeying the civil law.
Okay, are we enjoined in the book of Romans to obey the magistrate?
Yes, the Bible does say that, as long as that authority is under God, as long as it does not go against his laws, we are obligated to obey our magistrates.
Okay, yeah. The Bible says there in Romans that he's a servant to thee for good, right?
Yes.
And so that good, now this brings me to my next question. From a biblical worldview, how do you define good?
Well, God is good.
God is good. Okay,
Yes.
what else is good about God?
His character,
Okay,
his
and how
love,
is his character revealed?
through his love, through his word.
Through his word. That's
Yes.
what I was looking for.
Yes.
Exactly. We could make ideations and think about God, all day long. But if we really want him revealed to us and manifested to us, we search in his word.
Yes.
And Jesus said, search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, but they are they that testify of me.
Yes.
We want to know who God is. We open the word and we see this is who God is,
Yes.
This is why during the Dark Ages, even though you had professedly Christian nations at that time, they didn't really know what was good. They didn't know who God was because the Bible was in Latin and hidden away from the common people,
Yes.
And so they didn't have that ability. But now that we have Bibles, we can open the Word and we can analyze these things for ourselves. We can define what is good and what is bad.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we have 2 things sitting in front of us, and these are kind of our props for the day. And I wanted to show you this. My grandmother gave these to me, and I've held them as precious for a number of years. And if you don't know what these are the 10 Commandments. We have the first table, which are the obligations of man to his God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Don't bow down to idols. Shouldn't take my name in vain. And remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Jesus summarized this first tablet by saying, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy mind, all thy strength. The Sabbath commandment really shows that strength aspect because we have strength during the whole week, but God wants us to lay aside our strength, our physical strength, and lay aside our labors for one whole day out of the week, and that's the
Yes.
Sabbath right there.
Yes.
And Roger Williams also, he included all 4 of these on the first tablet. In fact, we find that Governor Winthrop was upset at him and did not want to give him a teaching position because he was arguing, look, you shouldn't force someone to go to church on the Sabbath. They need to make their own mind up about that.
Yes.
But what Roger Williams did say is that you could and should force people to keep these commandments. Now, why is that, Hannah?
Because these deal with our duty to man.
That's right.
Yes.
And so if these deal with our duty to man, so man to man, so our responsibilities, and we're talking about mankind, right?
Yes.
So these are our duties to our fellow men.
Yes.
And what the biblical worldview does is it takes these, actually, first of all, it protects these because this is rendering unto God the things that are God right here, right? This is protected, and praise the Lord, it's protected by the First Amendment.
Yes.
The founders realize this as well. But this one over here, this is the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate right here.
Yes.
This is what it says in Romans, this is the good that the magistrate wants to ensure is perpetuated in his kingdom.
Yes.
He wants to make sure that families are secure, that you don't have these outside forces coming in and tearing families apart,
Yes.
because the family is a building block of society, right?
Yes.
So honor thy father and thy mother, that's an important thing. And by the way, we're having a crisis right now dealing with Social Security,
Yes.
Social Security was brought out as a natural right. Now, it wasn't put in as an amendment, but it was a remnant of something we're going to discuss with FDR, with progressivism. And I'm not saying it's terrible, but if we had just kept this commandment and every parent had been taken care of in their old age by their children, that's the biblical ideal right there. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And yes, I realize that Social Security is a lifeline for many people today. But the ideal is that mother and father would take care or be taken care of those children that they took care of during
Yes.
their youth.
Yes.
That's the ideal. And that's why Jesus complained with the Pharisees who said, hey, if you come to the temple and you pronounce it's Corban over your house, well, then you don't have to sell it and provide for your aging parents,
Yes.
later on. You can just keep it all, and your parent, who knows what's going to happen. Maybe the Romans will give a little bit of bread and circus to, the emerging welfare state there.
Yes.
For your parents. And that's not the ideal. The ideal, of course, is that parents should be taken care of by the family. And I think that's the most loving way to do it as well. And many adult children do choose to bring their parents into their
Yes.
home if they can. And that's a huge blessing to
Yes.
every party involved. I realize it's not possible in every case,
Yes.
though. Okay, here's another commandment, thou shalt not kill. Obviously, we shouldn't go around murdering each other.
Yes.
And that's why it says that here. Now, guess what this also includes?
What?
It also includes babies.
Yes, definitely.
So from a biblical worldview, you cannot make an argument for abortion.
No.
Because it says right here, thou shalt not kill. And this is God's law. This is, from a biblical worldview, this is the essence of truth. These are natural rights right here. They are endowed by our Creator, right?
Yes.
These laws right here, they're even written on our... God said, I want to write my law on their hearts, right? And so we know in our own hearts we can, and that's why even people in pagan nations, the Spirit of God strives with all
Yes.
men. And God can write some of these things on their hearts. They don't always get the full picture of it, but God is striving with every man. That's the whole natural law theory. Even the Greeks were discussing natural law, even though they
Yes.
did not know the Creator God.
Yes.
But we have the revealed law here. We have the greatest example, and that's why we have the greatest republic ever, the greatest government that was ever established under men,
Yes.
Not talking about the theocracy that was there in the time of Israel. We had a judge that would only enforce God's law. This is dealing with the most perfect, and Augustine would describe this as, we have two cities. We have the city of God, which is the perfect idea of government, where God's revealed law reigns supreme. It is the most magnificent replication of everything divine that you can think of, right? And then he said you have the city of man, But the closer the city of man gets to the city of God, even though it will never get there fully, the closer you can get, the better it is.
Yes.
And I believe our republic is just about as close as you can get.
Yes.
And I'm very thankful that I'm a citizen of the United States of America. You know, interesting fact that Hannah and I just discovered today is that our, great grandfather, and add another great on your generation there, was a militiaman in the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So we are directly tied to our nation's fight for independence, and I hope that we're carrying on that tradition today.
Yes.
But it's really a little exciting tidbit. We just found out about that today. So we are definitely generations in on this preservation of the foundations of the American Republic. And that's why we love the biblical worldview. And because the biblical worldview was the worldview in which our nation was founded.
Yes.
Even the deists, people argue that, well, Jefferson was a deist, so he didn't really consider the United States to be Christian in its foundational principles. Well, the whole concept of a deist is that they're a believer in God,
Yes.
And they believe that God did endow us with natural rights.
Yes.
That he might not necessarily be totally involved right now, but he did endow us with natural rights. So that whole natural law tradition and that absolute truth that comes from the biblical worldview was definitely in the hearts and minds of the founders when they wrote our Constitution,
Yes.
when they petitioned during the Declaration of Independence,
Yes.
So we're also very thankful that our founding ancestors were members of that founding movement that raised up the American Republic.
Yes.
And they did so with a biblical worldview
Yes.
that established God's truth as absolute, that took the two tables of the law, that held that one table could not be mandated by government but must be protected by government,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We got the First Amendment from that, as I mentioned before. But also that God's revealed law in the second table is the foundation of all moral law,
Yes.
all civil law.
Yes.
Roger Williams attested to this. He came up with what he coined the doctrine of the two tables, right?
Yes.
But later on, Thomas Jefferson talked about natural rights, but what did he say in that preamble?
So in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed."
So the consent of the governed, who is that included?
That is the people.
That's us, right?
Yes.
We the people,
Yes.
right? So government does draw its consent from the people.
Yes.
It's not that the government says you must obey us regardless. That's tyranny.
Yes.
And the founders did not want a repeat of what was happening
In Europe.
in Europe and, King George.
Yes.
So they wanted to establish a republic that would be a safeguard for decades and if not centuries against tyranny rising up.
Yes.
Benjamin Franklin, after that famous convocation, they said, Mr. Franklin, what do we have?
Yes.
And he said, well, a republic if you can keep it.
Yes.
If you can keep it. And I believe there are forces working, maybe not intentionally, but just by their very nature, they're working to tear apart our republic.
Yes.
And I will say this, I would submit to you that a biblical worldview alone can really understand this.
Yes.
If we go into more progressive or postmodern worldviews, we have a hard time understanding this, and I believe that is where the root of the problem comes from. But speaking of those worldviews, let's talk a little bit more about modernism.
Yes.
Okay, so what are the two components of modernism?
So modernism, they had Marxism and also progressivism.
Okay, and those kind of rose to popularity roughly around the same time, right?
Yes.
We had Marxism, Stalinism over in Russia, right?
Yes.
And we had FDR with his progressive policies
Yes.
here in the United States. Government grew in both of those, didn't they?
Yes, it did.
It was a large. It wasn't limited government anymore.
No.
Right?
Yes, because in the progressive side, they wanted to use government to cure basically society's woes, you know? So they wanted to use scientific and government means to, maybe help people with their education or their health care or things like that. And then, of course, in Marxism, they wanted to take away the money from the rich and give it to the poor, as they said.
Okay.
But
redistribution of wealth.
Yes.
That class struggle.
Yes.
And in reality, Marxism is an economic theory that has expanded out into all other areas.
Yes.
It started with the recognition that potentially there was disparity in wages and access to the means of production.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And are there differences in wages?
Yeah, definitely.
Of course, right? You have the wealthy and you have the poor.
Yes.
Jesus said you always have that, right? You always have the poor, you always have the wealthy. But what Marxism says is we should not always have that. It should not be a meritocracy. It should not be you work harder, you get more money, Now, we're not talking about the government should allow theft, because some people do make their money. The whole phrase, the robber barons, they were part of the Industrial Revolution, but they really mistreated their employees.
Yes, that is absolutely not okay.
So, of course, those laws that were enacted controlling those and controlling monopolies, those were a good thing.
Yes.
Okay, because that is part of that second table, thou shalt not steal, and even thou shalt not kill. The working conditions were pretty terrible.
Yes, definitely.
So, obviously, government does have to step in at times to curb individuals' greed in a free market. But that should be in a very limited amount. The more you manipulate the free market, the more it becomes dysregulated.
Yes.
And perfect example is healthcare.
Yes.
Even if prevention was not the focus, which if prevention was the focus, that would save a lot of healthcare dollars.
Yeah.
But if we just go back a little over a century, around the early 1900s, there are many different sects of medicine. There were the homeopaths, the allopaths, the eclectics, the naturopaths, and the list could go on and on. There were all different types of medical schools. All these graduates had to go to take the same state licensing boards. And so many people chose their kind of favorite. Some would like to use the herbs or whatever, and they went to naturopathic school, maybe a homeopathic school. Those who wanted to use more of the medieval, European medicine, where they gave the strychnine, arsenic, they bled people, that kind of thing still. And some of that was going out of favor around 1900s or early 1900s. But even, mid 1800s, they were still giving heavy doses of arsenic and mercury and these things that were causing blindness. And they're toxins. You know? The whole theory or paradigm of allopathy was give big doses, feel a huge effect, and get cured or get killed, basically is how it worked. And that's why that brought about a reformation, a revolution of healthcare in the United States of America. We had an amazing turn of events in the 1850s, 1860s. We had the homeopaths that really became a major rival to the allopaths. And then you had the American Medical Association that was founded as a labor union to counteract the growing popularity of the homeopaths, And that war went on for quite a while, and eventually the allopaths won the war through intrigue because they enlisted the robber barons who, interestingly enough, they invest heavily in the pharmaceutical industry at the time that they were enlisted. They realized what was going to happen after this. And they changed medicine tremendously. And their goal was to increase the salaries of physicians, to make medical care cost more. And that was an artificial scarcity that they induced. And they closed down a lot of schools. It was a racist movement also. Abraham Flexner, if you want to read the Flexner Report, which I just don't understand why we can defend it. There are still physicians who are defending this man for what he wrote. He was an outright racist, bigoted, unscientific man, and not a medical man either. Yet we took his instructions on how medical education should be run, and then we took the power of the state and put the power of the state behind it.
Wow.
And then increasingly, the federal government and even local governments have gotten involved in medical care.
Yes.
Okay, and that's why the cost is so high, because we don't have a free market in healthcare. If we would have, and that's the beauty of limited government.
Yes.
Because if we allow people to go forward and hopefully we have a good and virtuous people. That's not always the case, but the more good and virtuous, the less laws you need, because they're not going to commit crime, right? That's the role of the church is very important here, because the church, the sphere sovereignty of the church is that they will make people moral, not by force or compulsion, but by entreaty and by opening the word of God. That's not the role of government. If the church is not doing that, then there's going to be a huge problem in society. And I think that's really where we are right now.
Yes, definitely.
The church has failed in its mission, and I take the blame of that. I'm a Christian. I need to do more with my own, devotional life and reaching out to others. And so it would behoove us to be more active and engaged in evangelism to try to help those around us.
Yes, definitely.
And to try to upbuild the morals of society. It's not government's place to do that. It's the church's sovereignty. We have the privilege of being able to do that.
Yes.
Now, the government does need to make sure that people are not violating the last 6 commandments. It's when we disregard these last 6 commandments that our nation has these major moral issues.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a quote from John Adams.
Yes.
It was 1798, I believe. It says, "Because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, and gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
So if it wasn't plain enough before, we see that the founders were looking at government from a biblical worldview.
Yes.
That's it right there. And they were not saying it's the role of the government to enforce, this virtuous desire to come near to the Lord and to, to receive salvation, receive cleansing from our sins, justification, sanctification, all those good things. But what he is saying is that we need to have both tablets in their proper sphere.
Yes.
This needs to be in the sphere of the church and the individual more than anything, because this is an individual right that we are endowed by our Creator with to choose Him, to choose to serve Him. If we're forced to serve Him, we're breaking the commandment here. This whole table is broken if we're forced to serve God.
Yes.
Right?
And I think, of course, we know the government is not supposed to enforce any of the first table of the commandments, but it is a thing that the more evil society becomes, the more laws they need, because if people were perfect, we wouldn't need any laws.
Exactly, that's right.
So it's not that we still are not supposed to be enforcing the first table of the law, but with more evil society does come more need for laws.
It's interesting you mention that, because even Rousseau, the French political philosopher that basically wrote the Bible of the French Revolution, he said that Christianity makes men docile. And he said, but they're easy to be controlled. They don't make good soldiers, and they aren't able to stand up against tyranny. Well, the reason why they're docile is because they're at peace and because they're obedient to God's commandments, We don't obey for salvation. We obey because we love God. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. And we realize, God, you know the best way for us to live.
Yes.
And that's why we do that, by His grace even. There's no merit in keeping His commandments, but there's power for a pure life in keeping His, and for happiness. We call them the 10 tables of, the 10 laws of happiness, or real true enjoyment in life.
Yes.
But Rousseau, he went to the opposite extreme and said, so now let's just throw all these things away and let's come up with our own definitions of good and evil, of good and bad, of law and crime. And we saw what happened.
Yeah, it was called the Reign of Terror.
Exactly. And it was terror. You had a group of people that came in, they're like, hey, off with the head of the king, right? And then later on, it's like, hey, off with the head of the people that said off with the head of the king. And then it was later,
off with those people, and then off with everyone.
Exactly, because they're like, hey, it's their fault now. No, it's their fault. No, it's their fault, because nothing was working out.
Yeah.
And eventually they had to realize, hey, I think we did something wrong here.
Yeah.
Reevaluate what we've done here. Oh, yeah, I think we need to bring these things back, because it turns out we didn't know what we were doing.
Yes.
And I think that's in some ways where we are today in society.
Yes.
You know, I mean, if we move away from a biblical worldview, which is what they did in the atheistic reign of, the reign of terror,
Yes.
they moved away from a biblical worldview and they reaped the consequences.
Yes.
And the same could happen to us. Now, when we talk about other worldviews, we need to define some of these, okay?
Yes.
Let's go back to progressivism, and I think one of the best ways of defining progressivism is to just let the guru of modern progressive political thought define it for us. Let's watch that little clip from FDR.
In our day, certain economic proofs have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. All of these rights spell security, and after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
So, Hannah, that's quite a list, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've got healthcare in there, right?
Yes.
We've got right to a good, healthy wage, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got a right to being taken care of in your old age, right? And numerous other things. Now, what's the difference between those rights and the rights that our founders kind of enumerated? And by the way, they didn't enumerate on them fully, and I believe part of the reason was they needed to keep some of those up to the people to define.
Yes.
Because when government defines rights, sometimes it takes those rights under its reins.
Yes.
And so I think the reason why it was so vague there, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was because, yes, those are fundamental rights, but Jefferson said among these.
Yes. So that means there's
there are
more.
others.
Yes.
Exactly. That's right. And from a biblical worldview, you can see that. It's revealed.
Yes.
It's called the revealed law.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about this concept of rights.
Yes. So there are, different concepts. There are the negative rights, which basically includes the stuff that is in the Bill of Rights, the things that basically it protects us from government.
Okay, now let me stop you there. That's a definitional term. We're not saying those are negative or
No,
bad.
no. It's not.
Yes.
And then there are the positive rights, which in the same way that the negative ones aren't all bad, aren't bad necessarily. That doesn't mean necessarily they're good
That
either.
the positive ones are
Yes.
good. We didn't make these terms.
No,
by the
no.
way. In fact, I would reverse them if I was giving the definitions.
Yes, but the positive came more at the time of progressivism. And so the positive rights are more of, like education, healthcare, things we were talking about before. maybe minimum wage, things like that. And so those are supposed to be provided by the government.
Yes. And we know that government, under the American Republic, those rights, once they're enumerated by the people, they must be provided for by the government, right?
Yes.
And I mean, there's so much there in the Declaration of Independence, there in the preamble, that show that that should be coming or emanating from a biblical worldview.
Yes.
I mean, it's obvious. God endowed them. God ordained them to us.
Yes.
And for this, we have government instituted, right?
Yes.
But when we move over to these positive rights, which are really negative, by the way, I think, in the construct of the American Republic, they greatly enlarge the government.
Yes, definitely.
And there was a great fear of government encroaching upon liberty, right?
Yes.
We even had two parties that developed, right,
yes.
because of that.
And around the time of George Washington's first presidency, we had the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans. And I believe they both didn't want the federal government to gain too much power, but they kind of went about it in a different way.
Yes.
Because the Democratic Republicans believed more in state governments, and the Federalists wanted a strong central government, but of course not one that would, be too strong.
That's right. And you can even look in the makeup of our Congress.
Yes.
We have senators. There, even a small state like Rhode Island still has 2 senators.
Yes.
And you think, well, that's not really representing a large body of people compared to California. California has 2 senators,
Yes.
So is that fair? Well, the reason why they made Congress a representation of the population of the state, and then they made the Senate just two individuals representing for the state, was because of that argument. They wanted to be fair even to the small states.
Yes, they did. Yeah, I was reading in my history a little while ago. Yeah, they had like a big argument about, what are we going to do? Because the small states felt, maybe they would be controlled by the bigger states. And so they were worried about that. So they came up with that plan that was kind of like a compromise between both sides.
Yes.
It had the representatives that had, the basically based on population, and then the Senate, which had to just like
I think it was a very wise compromise.
Yeah, I think so too.
And it has worked very well. But then again, what is the worldview of those senators, and what is the worldview of those in the lower house?
Yes.
If they are espousing a progressive worldview, they're going to be enumerating for their constituents, and maybe at the behest of their constituents, rights that are not necessarily emanating from those endowed rights that God gave us. Because let's go back to this right to health care. What is health care, by the way?
Well, it's an industry that provides care for sickness.
That's right. And are those individuals paid for providing that care?
Yes.
Yes. Paid quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right? And they're highly specialized, especially in today's environment.
Yes.
You don't have a lot of prevention and wellness going on, and you don't need a lot of highly specialized individuals to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, I can tell you, hey, go around in the neighborhood and tell everyone about that 5 glasses of water a day thing. And
I think I could do that.
I think you could do that. It's not too difficult. But unfortunately, we put most of our expenditures on something called tertiary care, which is very expensive health care. And that's because we're in crisis mode.
Yes.
I can get back. We could do a whole month's episode or, series of episodes on the crisis in healthcare.
Yes.
But we're not going to do that. We're just spare you that for now. In fact, as you know, I've worked for almost a decade on a documentary on this subject. So interviewing a lot of people, economists and politicians. And I realize at the end of the day, it's actually quite simple to solve this crisis, because we need limited government. We need the government to roll back from all of the entanglements with healthcare and allow the market to equalize things.
Yes.
I think that would really help.
Yes.
But that's kind of besides the point. But there is a huge industry, and it's staffed with highly trained personnel.
Yes.
But when you say that it's a right that you provide me healthcare, what does government have to do then?
Well, it has to force someone to do something for someone else.
Exactly.
Yes.
So government actually takes rights then from other people, the right to private property, because if a person is working, they're earning a salary, a wage,
Yes.
that becomes their private property, right? But if government says, look, you must provide health care for this individual, and you're charging me too much because we want to save money. So we are going to only pay you a certain amount. That's called central planning, socialized medicine.
Yes.
And there are rumblings of socialized medicine coming about because healthcare is so expensive. It doesn't have to be that way, though. After a close estimate and investigation of the initial setup of American healthcare after 1910, and this is not just my estimation, there's a great book called Rockefeller Medicine Men. It's written by a former professor at UCLA Berkeley, I believe. And he was given access to the AMA's files, and he did all this extensive research and found that the only solution to the corporatization of medicine and the exploitation of patients was to fully socialize medicine.
Oh, wow.
And I believe that I want to think the best of these people, but I can't, because the evidence points to the fact that I think they wanted to destroy our nation. I think they were out to destroy the American Republic. And you look at anything that Rockefeller and Carnegie and these robber barons laid their hands on. Yeah, they were living in the Gilded Age, but everything they touched did not turn to gold. It turned to dangerous things that would later come up and exploit vulnerabilities in the American Republic. You know, like for instance, the UN.
Yes.
There are so many things that the UN can declare, and because of the supremacy clause in our Constitution, which basically says that laws between different countries, so international law, is the highest law of the land.
Yes.
The UN's declarations and we ratify these treaties the UN is putting out. And by the way, the UN is a globalist organization. The United States was founded on limited government and isolationist principles.
Yes.
We wanted to stay away, not because we didn't care about people, but we realized we don't want to get embroiled with other people's conflicts,
Yes.
And unfortunately, we have totally done away with that. Teddy Roosevelt's gunboat diplomacy kind of sunk that ship a long time ago, and we have carried on with that tradition. But the UN can ratify a treaty, and we can take that in. It can become the highest law. It can actually override the Constitution.
That's so crazy.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
There should be nothing higher than the Constitution. And the founders did not envision the UN.
Yeah, of course.
They envisioned, okay, if we get to the point where we have to make a treaty with a country, that's pretty, significant.
Yeah.
We have to honor that.
Yeah.
But it's not that we need to make a treaty every 2 years, and ratify and totally supersede our Constitution. I think that's a dangerous thing. And we know Rockefeller had a heavy hand in that.
Yeah.
But let's talk about some of the more modern ideologies and how they impact this concept of natural rights, because there are some that I believe are even diverting more than the founders' intent than progressivism or even Marxism. So what are they?
So we have postmodernism, which basically, unlike, even modernism and, of course, the biblical worldview, where there is an absolute truth, in postmodernism, there is not an absolute truth, because you could have a truth and it could be based on your language, your social status, where you grew up, anything like that.
Or even your religion.
Yes, your religion too, of course. Yeah, so that could be, so you could have a truth and I can have a truth, and they can both be true. But that totally is deviant from the biblical worldview, because in the biblical worldview, there's only one truth, and that's God.
That's right, in His Word.
Yes.
So the Bible establishes absolute truth, but what the postmodern worldviews establish is relative truth.
Yes.
It's like, you have your truth, I have my truth, we can be okay with that, But what that does is it allows the majority, and eventually you have a majority who believe a certain thing, and then they can violate the rights of others.
Yes.
We know that Bentham, who is a famous English philosopher, came up with the concept of utilitarianism.
Yes.
And in this, he thought, okay, religion doesn't really need to be, a real big part of life. Let's put it to the private sphere, and then let's focus on satisfying the pleasure of the majority. Okay, and believe it or not, I think that's how we have a lot of these modern political campaigns run.
Which I think is still a very hard thing to do, though.
Yes. Oh, of course, it is. But if you can find something that resonates with everyone,
Yeah.
and for instance, your mom is from Brazil, and she said that they had a candidate at one time that promised to put a steak on every plate. And hey, who wouldn't want a steak? Those were expensive over there, and not everyone could afford it. There's a great disparity of wealth there in Brazil, especially during the time my wife was there. And everyone would love to have
of course,
steak on their plate, even in the favelas where they have basically cardboard shanties they're living in, So that was a campaign promise. I don't think it was fulfilled.
Yeah.
It'd be very difficult to do.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it appealed to people, and that might have even put him in office. I don't know if that particular candidate won. But that's an example of people saying, look, we know you like this, we know you want this, so we'll give it to you if you bring us into office. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, from a biblical world, that's postmodernism in a nutshell, by the way. Okay? Because it's finding something you want and using government to get it. Okay? Now, another word for that is covetousness. Okay?
Ooh.
Thou shalt not covet is one of these laws right here.
So
it's the last commandment here. Thou shalt not covet. Now, if I say, I want, I was born with a societal construct of being a man, but I really, really want to be a woman. That's postmodern feminism, right?
Yes.
I'm coveting someone else's gender, and I really, really want that, and I'm willing to even say, government, come over here and give me that,
Yes.
And that is one of those rights that is not endowed by our Creator, but it's promised by these politicians who want to please the majority.
Yes.
And when you please the majority, you get the majority vote, and you stay in office.
Yes.
And that is a travesty.
Yes.
The population really needs to wake up to that and say, look, we can't do this anymore.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's going to take a lot more than just me saying that, to bring that about. But if we look at that whole construct of covetousness, in 2 Peter 2, verse 3, I believe, it says that men will, with covetousness, make merchandise of you. And that is basically what postmodernism does.
Yes.
It says, hey, come on over here. I've got something good for you. And we're going to push biblical morality out of the way. We're going to push the Bible. We're going to relegate it to the private sphere. Now, we believe in religious pluralism. You can believe what you want, but you just keep it private. You just keep it quiet, okay? And meanwhile, over here, we're going to please the majority, and we're going to give them everything their heart covets after, whether it be another gender, whether it be the social esteem or apparent social esteem of another race, like we got to go after a systemic racism that we perceive. It may not even be the case, but we say, look, I want more status in society, and so that your critical race theory kind of comes in there, Not saying there are inequalities in the world. And by the way, biblical Christianity deals with inequalities, but it's not through government intervention. It's through a change of the heart.
Yes.
Because Christ said, all ye are brethren.
Yes, all men are equal.
Exactly.
There's no slave, no free man.
Exactly.
Everyone is equal in God's sight.
Exactly. So God takes care of those issues, the real issues, But politicians come along, and by the way, I had to read the book Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, and it wasn't because I need to learn those tactics to utilize them myself. It was to learn them so I can be wary of them when they're used by other politicians. And one of the things that Saul Alinsky, by the way, he devoted this book to Lucifer. Yeah, it's the craziest thing.
It's crazy.
And there are a number of prominent politicians who have said this is the best book I've ever read. I'm not going to name names. You can look that up if you like. I don't necessarily recommend reading it. You can, but please don't follow those principles there, because they are postmodernism at their core. One of the things that Saul Alinsky recommends is you go, first of all, into a community. If you're an aspiring politician, you go into a community and you find out what makes people mad, right?
Yeah.
It's not even about pleasing or pleasure at this time. It's totally beyond Bentham and his utilitarianism. Find out what makes them mad. And then his exact words, rub raw the sentiments.
Oh.
Okay? Rub raw those sentiments. You cause so much animosity. You polarize that community, and then you get the majority to, and by the way, you got to find out the resentments of the majority in your community, because then they'll vote for you. Because they're so angry, it's like poking a stick in a hornet's nest.
Yeah.
They're going to go out to the polls in great numbers. They're going to all vote for you. That's a political strategy, but it's not a biblical political strategy. And by the way, it should not be just the party that gets the most upset wins the election. That's usually how it works.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because when we're happy, we can become complacent. We say, "Oh, I don't need to vote. It's not a big deal. Things are going good." But it's those people, "Oh, I hate that politician. I'm going to go vote against him. I want to get him out of office." And I'm not saying we need to have that mentality, but we're warned, even in the Federalist Papers, that if we enumerated rights, then someone would come along and use those as a means of saying, "Come on over here. I'll take care of you. Just vote for me."
Yes.
Hamilton warned about that.
Yes.
And so they knew that could happen, and they were wary of that. And you had, Jefferson on the side of the Democratic, Republicans, and you had Hamilton on the side of the Federalists. But really, they all wanted the same thing. They all wanted to make sure that government did not get out of control.
Yes.
But when these individuals come over and say, "Look, we can jettison this one over here, the last 6 commandments, and we're going to come up with our own laws, and those laws are going to be based on our own rights."
Yes.
Those are going to be based on what you want majority, because, hey, I'll get elected. And that's what's going on. I mean, we have whole platforms that are based on these extra judicial, extra biblical, natural rights that are not God endowed natural rights. And because of that, what that leads to is corruption of society.
Yes.
And meanwhile, because of religious pluralism, because hey, you can have your truth, I can have my truth, but we'll just keep it private,
Yeah.
While we're kind of, and this is a problem for Christians, while we're over in the closet worshiping God, and when we peek our head out and they throw rocks at us and say, "Hey, don't bring those commandments back over here," then we go back in, and meanwhile, the world is becoming destroyed by this other postmodern political philosophy, And I think we need to come out and let our light shine.
Yes, definitely. That's very important.
We have to let our light shine.
Yes.
And unless we do that, unless we dialogue with these individuals and show them, the church has a very important dialogue. To show them that the only way that they're going to find pleasure or satisfaction or a comfort in their anger is through Christ.
Yes.
Is through Jesus Christ. Because we're told in the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. Unless the church is active in doing that, society is not going to improve. But postmodernism says, don't bring that church stuff here. Mm-hmm. We have to be bold, and we have to realize that because we've kind of kept in the closet for so long with biblical principle, that we're going to come out, we're going to face persecution.
Yes.
And that's it's going to be a fact of life.
Yes.
But we know that all who live godly in Jesus Christ will suffer persecution.
Yes.
I mean, look at Charlie Kirk.
Yes.
A perfect example of that.
Yes, definitely.
He stood up for biblical principle, and he was willing to lay down his life for that.
Yes.
And so we need to pick up that banner and say, we're going to go forward, we're going to dialogue, and we are going to keep talking.
The new generation, indoctrination, separation to destroy